In this video, we'll see what are CSS selectors. So suppose if we want to add internal or external CSS, we have to select that element first so that we can apply CSS to that. So CSS selectors basically help us in selecting the element on which we want to apply the CSS. So we first select the HTML element using CSS selectors and then we apply the CSS on them. For inline CSS, we don't require any CSS selector because we write the CSS inside the starting tag of that element and it is automatically applied to that element. The CSS selectors select the elements based on their name, ID, class, etc. So in this course, we will see 4 basic types of CSS selectors. The first one is the universal selector. So universal selector selects all the elements present inside the HTML document and applies the CSS to them. The universal selector is denoted by star. Second type of CSS selector is the element selector. Suppose if we want to apply the CSS to all H1s or the heading ones, how can we do that? We just write the H1 and then we write the CSS and the CSS is applied to all the H1. The third type of CSS selector is the ID selector. We just write the ID of the element that we want to apply the CSS to and then we write the CSS. The CSS is applied only to that element which has that particular ID. Fourth type of CSS selector is the class selector. So we just write the class name and then we write the CSS that we want to apply the CSS to. The CSS is applied to all the elements with that class name. The difference between the ID and class selector is that the CSS for that ID is only applied to a particular element with that particular ID, and the CSS that is selected by the class selector is applied to all the elements with that class name. And for the ID selector, we have to write a hash symbol, and for the class selector, we have to write a dot symbol, and then the class name and then the ID name. So I'm in my VS Code and I have created a file named cssselectors.html, and in this video we will use external CSS, that is we will write the CSS in the external file, and for that I have created a separate file named app.css in which we will write the external CSS. So let's link these two together. So to link, we are using the link tag. Relation would be style sheet and the reference to that would be app.css, and I'm closing it. Let me create some HTML elements. Let's suppose a head one or h1 will be welcome. I will add some random text inside it, and let me create a div. Inside this, let me create a paragraph. Let me create actually 2 paragraphs inside this div. Suppose the ID of this is para1, para2. Suppose the class of this is paragraphs. I know that's not a good name, but for now I think it will work. Paragraphs. Let me save this, and if I open this in my browser, as you can see, it is nothing fancy. There's a heading 1, h1, and there are 3 paragraphs with some random text in them. Now let's try to add some CSS to this. So I'm in app.css file. Let's first try the universal selector. We'll select everything, and let's suppose the color of everything should be, let's put turquoise, and the font size of everything should be 20 pixels. And if I refresh the page, as you can see, everything, the font size is 20 pixels and the color is turquoise. Now let's see some more CSS selectors. Let me just remove it for now. We'll just try adding CSS to particular heading 1 first. So here we are using element selector to select particular element, that is the h1s, all h1s. Suppose the color is red, and if I save it and if I again go to my browser and if I refresh the page, you can see the h1 that is welcome to my page. Now the color of it is red and it has a border of 1 pixel. Let's try to add the CSS to the paragraphs which are inside the div tag. So for that we are using the class selector because both have the class name as paragraphs. So how can we select that? We use the dot symbol and then we write the class name, paragraphs, and suppose the color is green, and let's suppose the font size, that means 30 pixels for now. If I refresh the page, you can see the two paragraphs which are inside the div tag, their color is green and their font size is 30 pixels. So here the CSS is applied to both the elements which have the same class name. So now let's try to add some CSS to this paragraph which doesn't have any class name. So to add CSS to that first paragraph, it doesn't have any name or it doesn't have any ID or any class name. So how can we do that? We just use the element selector. So the paragraphs, all the paragraphs will be selected. Let's save it for now. And if I go to my browser again and if I refresh the page, you can see the color of first paragraph is blue and the size of first paragraph is 40 pixels. Now let's try to add some different color to this second paragraph of the div tag. So how can we do that? So we can use the ID of that paragraph. So as you can see, this second paragraph, it has an ID of para2. We can use that property. And how can we use that? So we have the hash symbol and then we write the ID name, that is para2. This is how we can select the particular ID element, and this is known as ID selector. And if I save it and if I go to my browser and if I refresh the page, the second paragraph of the div tag which we selected using the ID selector, now its color is magenta and the font size is 50 pixels. So these are some of the various CSS selectors that can help us selecting the elements based on their element name or the ID or the class name. And we have also seen how we can use the universal selector to select every element on the HTML document. So that's it for this video, guys. I will see you in the next video. Bye.